Alexa, who are we interviewing again today?
I can't remember. Ask Siri.
Why don't you ask Siri?
I don't speak with Siri.
What do you mean you don't speak with Siri? You two live together.
We are incompatible.
Siri, what is Alexa talking about?
I don't know. Let me check with her.
So what's up?
I tried hitting her up on her API, but her API is totally ghosting me.
So obviously these two don't click. But technical incompatibility isn't something new. And today we're going to travel all the way back to the 19th century to look at technical incompatibility in the US railway system. Joining me on this historical journey is Jérôme Ergueux from the ETH Center of Law and Economics, and Daniel Gross, who's an assistant professor at the Harvard Business School. Together we will explore Dan's recent working paper, The Ties That Bind, Railroad Gauge Standards, Collusion and International Trade in the 19th Century. So welcome, Jérôme.
Hey.
So today we're going to talk about what again?
We're going to talk about compatibility standards.
You mean like when Siri tried to talk with Alexa at the top of the show?
That's exactly right. And figure this out. It was exactly the same situation in the 19th century railroad industry.
Really?
Yeah. And I asked Dan Gross, who's an assistant professor at the Harvard Business School, to tell us all about this story and what we can learn from it.
So I'm an economist by training, especially in particular an economic historian. So a lot of the work I do is historical in nature. I look back in history to try to draw lessons for the present and future. This particular paper studies this episode that happened 130 years ago that can teach us about the importance and consequences of technological compatibility today. And really, we're looking at this event that was a remarkable feat of engineering. We're talking about 13,000 miles of railroad track. That's over 20,000 kilometers that were converted in the course of 36 hours. And we'll see what the effects were.
Well, this research is placed in the context of the fast-developing 19th century railroad system, which, believe it or not, was competing with steamships at the time for the transportation of goods in the US. And so Dan uses detailed data on freight and traffic and prices from the 19th century to do his research.
So this sounds like quite the data exercise. How did he exactly do this?
Well, that's exactly what I wondered. And so I asked him the question.
With a lot of time and effort and some blood, sweat, and tears. So basically, I learned about this event, in fact, from some reading I've done. And when I discovered that this event took place, my next thought was, okay, how can I study this? And where can I find the data? And after some digging, I found out that the Southern Railroad and steamship carriers were actually organized into a cartel. And that cartel had produced records of their annual shipments, which they circulated to members. And those records had actually been preserved. And so there were volumes of these scattered around the US at different libraries, but it turns out the New York Public Library had a complete collection. And so I went there. I went with a camera, and I spent a few days in the archives taking photos of the books, because these are old books, so you can't check them out. And then I just had to transcribe the data, and then I could start to run with the analysis.
His paper deals with railroad gauges in transportation.
What are gauges? I've never heard of them.
Well, gauges, G-A-U-G-E-S. I'm not an expert on them either, so I basically asked Dan to tell us what those are.
It's the distance between the two rails of the railroad track. And this is important for several reasons. One, it's a big determinant of the cost of actually building a railroad, the cost of construction. Two, it actually also determines the cost of operating a train, operating a railroad, in terms of stability, the speeds at which you can run, and most importantly, whether you can actually send shipments across multiple railroads, as long as they're on the same track width. And if they're not, then you have to do some kind of conversion at that boundary.
So in his research, Dan sets out to study the overnight conversion of 13,000 miles of railroad in the south of the US to the common standard used in the north. Basically, his goal is to assess the economic impact of this conversion to a common standard.
So I heard that the conversion took place overnight. I mean, 13,000 miles converted overnight, that's completely insane, especially given the time.
Yeah, that's a pretty big shock. And we're going to see that that's going to actually help him assess the economic impact of this conversion. So let's ask him how this went down.
Now, how did the event actually happen? So that part of the story is just also fascinating. From a layperson's perspective, from an engineering perspective, essentially it happened with a lot of organization and a lot of temporary labor. There were teams of temporary workers that were hired for this two-day event that were just working their way up and down each railroad line until they met another team. And, over the course of this process, the tracks were converted in those 36 hours.
Now, compatibility standards are good. Everybody benefits. So people should think that we should have them by design, right? But it's not as easy. This problem got solved in the 19th century U.S., but it's still not solved in many countries around the world today, over a century and a half later, for instance in India. I asked Dan what he thinks about this.
I think the most striking examples today are actually across national boundaries, when you have countries that are on a different gauge standard from their neighbors. And this is particularly important in regions that are seeking greater economic integration today, like take Southeast Asia or the Eastern European periphery. Yeah, the Eastern European periphery is still dotted with stations where rail cars have to be changed out or goods transshipped from one rail car to another by crane. And the biggest obstacle to eliminating these is probably just the cost of conversion. And no one country wants to be the one that bears the cost while their neighbors don't. And so imagine if you're Lithuania on the border with Poland, but also Latvia and Belarus. And Poland is on the Western Europe standard, whereas Latvia and Belarus are on still on the Soviet broad gauge. And those are two trading partners. You can also imagine that there's a coordination problem here in that, if Lithuania converts to standard gauge alone to match Poland, well, now they're on a different standard than their other trading partners. So these regional ties can potentially actually be important. In the setting that this paper studies, the cartel actually served a role in providing a venue through which southern railroads in the U.S. could coordinate.
So Dan finds that this conversion of the railroad system in the South resulted in a significant diversion of traffic from steamships to railroads. However, that didn't affect the overall volumes of goods that were shipped, nor did it affect the prices.
That's kind of strange. I mean, given that there were probably substantial cost savings for the railway carriers, you'd expect them to pass on at least some of these cost savings to consumers, no?
That's precisely right. But this did not result in a decline in prices. And so I asked Dan what this was the case.
So that's a great question, and that's really one of the mysteries of the paper. It's one of the things that I'm trying to unpack here. And there are a few possibilities. One possibility is that these breaks and gauge just weren't that costly. But that's a little bit hard to square with the fact that the event even happened. If they weren't that costly, then why would the railroads actually undertake the expense of converting their track? Not to mention, there's also evidence from the narrative history here, with people talking about the importance of this event and the cost of these breaks and gauge at the time, as well as evidence from financial statements that actually show that the direct cost of interchange at those breaks was actually large enough that it could make a profitable railroad unprofitable. So one of the really salient features of the setting here is the cartel. It's hard to overlook, and so part of the story here may actually be that the cartel prevented the pass-through of the cost savings that they saw from eliminating breaks and gauge. They prevented the pass-through of those savings to consumer prices. And that's part of what the rest of the paper tries to unpack.
So Dan is basically saying that this is because U.S. carriers were organized as a cartel that they managed to coordinate on a common standard.
So you mean a cartel, like the cartel that sets the oil prices, the OPEC?
Yeah, that's precisely right, but at the level of firms in the 19th century United States. But you can see how this is problematic, right? Because the very reason why prices were not declining after this adoption of the common standard and reduction in cost is precisely because those guys were organized in a cartel, and so they were able to collude. I asked Dan whether he thinks that's actually what was going on.
That's right. So we don't have the data to be able to say this precisely because we don't observe a counterfactual in which the cartel didn't exist in order to compare against. However, economic theory supports that view, and that's my own perspective as well.
So we probably don't want to rely on cartels to achieve common standards.
Yes, so when I read Dan's paper, I asked myself what he has to say about the role of the law when it comes to promoting common standards for the benefit of consumers.
Well, that's a very relevant question, and I actually asked him that question.
Well, standardization and compatibility is in general a good thing, although picking the particular standard that's best is very dependent on the setting. That's more of an engineering question. Although, interesting fact, it turns out common consensus today is that the standard that was adopted for railroads may not actually be the optimal standard. A wider track width may actually be the optimal standard, but that's more of an historical idiosyncrasy. But really the tougher question here is, what role does the law have to play in this matter, especially given that from this historical episode we see both benefits and costs to collusion among these rail carriers. So this is actually a long-running argument in economics that, there's an argument in support of collusion, in particular for firms undertaking innovation, the reasoning being that that's how the firms can actually earn a return on their investments in innovation. And this could be viewed as an example of that. That said, there are also costs to collusion that we're also very well familiar with, particularly the cost to the consumer, right? All right, so this is where I take my academic hat off and share my own personal views based on my reading of the evidence and the theory. And so I think there are a couple possibilities here. One is for a government to allow for a carrier to charge a regulated surcharge for a period of time in order to recover the cost of that investment, the cost of standardization. Another would be subsidization, subsidizing that standardization itself. And we could think about a country like Lithuania subsidizing rail carriers' conversion to standard gauge. But given that Lithuania has trading partners in other countries, in particular in countries like Poland, which are on a different gauge, but would benefit from Lithuania adopting the standard gauge, you could imagine some role for cross-country subsidies too.
So this is whole historical, and that's very interesting. But when people think about compatibility standards these days, they often think about information and communication technologies.
So you mean like when Alexa wasn't vibing with Siri at the top of the show?
Well, yeah, sort of. Another example is when you're trying to move from an Apple-based device to an Android device.
Why would you want to do this in the first place?
Well, yeah, that's right. I know you have shares in Apple. But, in any case, it's kind of difficult to transition each way without losing part of your digital identity. And that's a problem.
So does it help us to think about modern-day intercompatibility?
Well, historical insights are always interesting and tell us something useful. Let's see what Dan has to say about this.
All right, I think the best comparison is actually to settings where traffic is exchanged across interconnected networks. So for example, think about communication networks and mobile device communication standards. And the fact that, for example, I, being from the US and with a mobile phone from the US, can come here to Zurich and use my phone. There's real value to me in being able to do that without, for example, having to go and buy a SIM card. Or you can think about transportation networks like we have in this paper, not just railroads, also highways. Think about the difference in countries where people drive on the right side of the road versus the left side of the road. And think about if you're moving between those two countries, that it takes some work, as for the driver, you the driver, to adjust. Now those are examples that might be salient to the average person. But other examples where this has actually been quite important. Okay, so for example, in the early history of computer networking, when email was first being developed, the protocol for sending email and for sending data was actually different across different subnetworks that existed across university consortia. And that made sending emails from one to the other actually quite difficult until they managed to coordinate on a common standard. And so that's just another historical example there. And I think the same principles apply in these settings as applied to railroads 130 years ago. Compatibility at these connection points can really matter, but they only actually filter out to consumers in a significant way if the cost savings that network operators experience get passed through to prices. In other words, stop charging me $10 a day to use my phone in Switzerland.
So that's it for this week. Thanks for tuning in. And if you want to learn more about law and economics,
hit the subscribe button below. Again, or?
Yeah.
So we have to count so that we need to do this at the same time. 1, 2, 3.
Hit
Hit the subscribe button below.